Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to do just a little bit of housekeeping that I hope will be helpful to you, especially since this is new for everybody and you signed up for something you may not even know what you're getting yourself into. So, this is kind of an overview and some housekeeping. Each week, we're going to begin with a plenary session that I'll lead and teach. And hopefully, it's not too much like drinking from a fire hose, but it'll be a lot of information, and probably even more so the next 3 weeks. And the first week tonight and the last week, probably not quite as much upfront information. The rest of the time each week will actually happen in the small groups. And those have been pre assigned. The group leaders, they know to expect you. They'll introduce themselves and they'll be there to kind of review the material. Excuse me. And their main job is to foster the discussion. So, those of you who are really talkative, they'll want to hear from somebody who's not always really talkative. And those who are a little bit shy, they'll encourage them. Um, during the plenary, you're going to be muted, and hopefully that's the case now because we have so many online. We have 200 people signed up for this, which is great. But we do encourage you, if you have a tech problem and it's kind of in that emergency um, category, then use the chat feature and say, I really need help here. I can't hear or whatever. Um, but also some of you may find it really helpful for processing information. I know that a lot of people just kind of need to be able to do that. The Zoom link that you use to get online is not the same one anybody else used. It's unique to that device, but it will be the same one for all 5 sessions. So if you got on tonight, you want to hang on to that. And yet, last thing, the materials will be emailed each Tuesday for the following week, and the materials will also be on the church's website. So hopefully that'll be helpful. So let's get started. I kind of think of this as a parable. I think I probably ran across it 15 years ago now. It was on 60 Minutes. It was a story about Harvard professor John Stilgoe's class, The History of Landscape, which doesn't sound like a thriller, but it was the most popular course on campus. And the reason was of what he really tried to do, and that was to help them to see. So the very first day of class, he would say, just leave your stuff, we're going on a walk. And they walked around Cambridge, Mass there, looking at signs, looking at manhole covers. And he said, what, you see that? This manhole cover was made in Anniston, Alabama. Why are manhole covers made in Alabama up here in Boston area? He saw mailboxes and signs and all kinds of things. And then when he got back, he put up on the board a couple of different images. And one of those was the FedEx logo. And he made this point. He said, you get into Harvard because you can really do amazing things with numbers and letters. That's how you get into the Ivy League. You got to be really good with numbers and letters, at least one of those. And he said, but the problem is when you become really good with numbers and letters, you no longer see things the same way. And in fact, he said, if you brought in a young child who cannot yet make sense of letters, the child would see something that not all of you see. And he said, do you see the arrow? And the arrow he was referencing is this little arrow right here between the E and the X, pointed to the right. It's there in the abstract, in the gray of the background. I think of this as a kind of parable for not numbers and letters, but when we get so busy living life that maybe we don't take enough time to stop and see what's going on. So how do we make sense of our lives in that regard? Socrates famously said, an unexamined life is not worth living. So that's what we want to do. We want to examine our lives and to ask some really good questions. This course, A Life Worth Living, is kind of based out of, well, it's really based out of a course called that at Yale. The first one, the top one there, Psychology and the Good Life, is still the most popular class on campus. And it's in the psychology department, obviously. And when the New York Times did a piece on it, they nicknamed it Happiness, most popular course on campus. And it's a very different approach than what we're doing. But Miroslav Volf, whom many of you heard a couple of weeks ago in our virtual conversation with David Brooks, he pioneered at the Yale Center for Faith and Culture a course called A Life Worth Living, which is giving a really good run for its money against the other one. They, they fostered this course, then they developed one for the Divinity School, but their vision was, what if we could have one that was in the communities? That wasn't just for undergrads at an Ivy League school, but that everybody could participate in. And one of our church members, Phil Love, and his wife, Patty, they were very big believers in this. In fact, Phil worked on this project for several years, and they came up with this vision. And they sent me to Pepperdine about a year and a half ago out there in Malibu. It was a really tough assignment. And the whole week was to focus on what would a life worth living look like if we did it in a community with people at different stages of life. So our vision of the course is different. It's for people at all stages of life, it's not just for undergrads. And I think as a result of that, it makes for a richer conversation. We'll have people at all different stages of their life and their work and in retirement and students and whatever. And it's also for all persons, not just those with a particular religious perspective. It may be sponsored by a church, but this isn't a Christian class. It's not a Judeo-Christian class, not a Buddhist class. I think that next little phrase there, the focus is really on different worldviews. Now, Miroslav teaches at Yale, so he calls them contending particular universalisms, which is a really fancy way of saying worldviews. What we're looking at is not the 5 major world religions and what did they say about a life worth living. No, we're looking at different worldviews, and we're drawing on a range of people, philosophers, ethicists, cultural critics, poets, some of them rooted in a particular religious tradition, but not all of them. And very important, all perspectives will be welcomed, and not just welcomed, but honored in this class. And so when you get in a small group and you're a little bit shy about saying, well, I have a totally different view. Don't be afraid of that. Feel free to share that and articulate it. We're going to wrestle with lots of questions, but 2 in particular. And this is what the Yale class does as well. The first one is, what do you think makes for a life worth living? The emphasis there, of course, is not just a life worth living, but what do you think? You know, this is you look at your life like looking at the FedEx logo, and that's a hard question. What do you think makes for a life worth living? And it's the kind that we just kind of go through the motions and maybe never really articulate. But the second one's even harder. How would you decide on an answer? Well, I want to say a word about that second question. In some ways, this parallels what I did with students in grad school for 30 years. And we call it the work of deconstruction and reconstruction. So it starts by taking apart one's beliefs. Maybe a good analogy here would be if you're remodeling a house. You know, like if you watch HGTV and they're going to take this house apart and remodel it, well, you have to start taking it apart. And one of the things you do when you take it apart is decide, well, I need to inspect this. Maybe this piece of lumber could be reused. Maybe it's shiplap, you know, and it's so popular. But maybe this needs to be thrown away. And the inspection happens in the readings and in the groups. And the reconstruction is an ongoing process really all our lives. It's putting things back together. The key, of course, is to keep asking the questions. And I love this Mencken quote. For every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and probably wrong. There are no simple, easy answers to any of this. The course will use the phrase a life worth living, but sometimes we'll say the good life. We're using that interchangeably. And I realize that for some of you, one of those terms means something very different from the other, and that's okay. But other terms people use in writing about this, they'll talk about flourishing or a full life or living with purpose. Some even talk about the joyful life. But it's not the same as the images there on the right. It's not the same as the cultural messages that, have you in the Adirondack chair with the drink or on the island, although my gosh, wouldn't that be nice to be there right now? But it's not about just kicking back and enjoying the finer things of life. But what is it? What exactly is it? Well, that's what we'll wrestle with. One of the things that I find a helpful image is from the novelist Chaim Potok and his mother, good Jewish mother, who ever since he was a little boy told him, "You'll grow up, you'll be a doctor, you'll keep people from dying." She said that when he was little. She said it when he went to high school, when he's going off to college. "You'll be a doctor, you keep people from dying." Finally, he told her, I'm sure it took some nerve. He said, "Mom, I don't want to be a doctor. I don't want to keep people from dying. I'm going to be a writer. I want to show people how to live." So for Potok, that's what he thinks of with his writing, that it is a way to show people how to live. So let me just say a few things about our approach to what it means to have a life worth living. Several key words. The first one is wondering. I love this quote from St. Augustine. He's probably one of the most influential thinkers in civilized history in the West, at least. He wrote, "People travel to wonder at the height of the mountains, at the huge waves of the seas, the long course of the rivers, the vast compass of the ocean, circular motion of the stars, and yet they pass by themselves without wondering." Augustine in the 5th century wrote a book called The Confessions. And really, a lot of people consider it the first piece of literature to be kind of introspective, self-examining, autobiographical in a sense. And so we're going to be wondering about our own lives. We've wondered at big mountains, but let's wonder about ourselves. Also examining, remember the Socrates quote, I think the unexamined life is still worth living, but maybe a better way to say it would be the examined life could lead to a fuller one. This is a fascinating little story or image. Jose Luis Borges's The Library of Babel is a short story, and it just reminds me of the notion of searching. In this short story, there's a library. It contains every book ever written. But not only that, it contains every possibility of letters and words that could ever exist. But the librarians, because there's so much there, they're not sure they'll ever find the meaning. Now that's a fascinating kind of concept. When we think about what does a life worth living look like, well, there's so many options that how could we ever know? Well, that's part of what we're going to do is search. We're also going to question. I really do believe the real work happens in the small groups, and it happens within each of us, at least to the degree that we invest in the process. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke put, do not now seek the answers which cannot be given you because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything, live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. And isn't that an interesting phrase? Maybe even without noticing it. There's also the notion of wrestling. I love this little phrase that Carol Lakey Hess uses, that instead of Q&A, it's Q and W, questioning and wrestling. Q&A implies, okay, here's the answer. But Q and W says, we're going to have to work at this. And then just a kind of brief overview. We have 5 weeks together, 5 Monday nights. Tonight, the introduction. Then we'll wrestle for 3 weeks with some topics specifically: self and others, pain and pleasure, work and leisure, and then lastly, the way forward. What do we want to do as a result of this? I want to say something about these three topics in particular. If you're into computer programming, you might get the joke on the t-shirt. If you're not, you wouldn't necessarily get it. But it says there are two types of people in the world, those who understand binary and those who don't. Because binary works with ones and zeros, and you flip them on, you flip them off, and that's what you get. Well, it's kind of typical for us to think of, well, there's self or others instead of self and others, pain and pleasure. This is what the world gives us, work and leisure. So we'll wrestle with both sides of the equation each week, trying to figure out what that says about what a life worth living looks like. And every session, both the plenaries and the small groups, we'll try to remember to end every week by saying, it's something to think about. The line itself comes from this really interesting book called Socrates Cafe. Christopher Phillips is a philosopher, and he has this great kind of thing he does where he goes to coffee shops and other public locales, and he invites anybody who's there. Now, some people know about it ahead of time, but anybody who's there can just join him. And we're going to be over in this corner here and have our latte, and we're going to wrestle with what is beauty? What is truth? But they always end by just simply closing with something to think about. And that's kind of the approach we'll take because, as I mentioned, we're not really trying to find the answer as if such a thing exists, but really more to wrestle. So it's something to think about. So we'll get started. Session 1, building your bridge. I took that line from the quote from Nietzsche. No one can build you the bridge on which you and only you must cross the river of life. It's an interesting notion to think about what does the river, what does the bridge that you're building look like for you to cross the river of life? I like how the puzzle piece in the abstract there looks like a person outlined with their ears and trying to figure out, what is our life about? Well, hopefully you got the assignment and you read the introduction or a part of the introduction from David Brooks' The Second Mountain, or perhaps you heard him when he was with Miroslav a couple of weeks ago. I'm just going to throw a few things up. Of course, when you're in a small group, if you've done the reading and you think of something that I didn't even cover, feel free to bring it up. That's just part of the process. Brooks, of course, he's not talking about building a bridge. He's got a different metaphor. He talks about life's first mountain as building a career, starting a family, making a mark in the world. That's a pretty common kind of notion. But he sees the second mountain as something different. It's like seeking something more fulfilling. And he sees it as really going beyond one's self. You may remember that it could be you get knocked off of the first mountain. And that's when you realize, maybe this isn't what I thought. Or you get up and the first mountain's not very fulfilling. It's not that life knocked you over, it's that, it's just boring. So one question for you to think about, a couple of them actually, what do you make of this two mountain scheme for looking at life? Does it resonate with you and your journey? And if so, where are you? Are you in the valley, on the first mountain, second mountain? Is there such a thing as a third mountain? I don't know. And why do you think he equates happiness with the first mountain, but joy with the second one? Do you agree with his definitions, the difference between happiness and joy? Some people make that distinction. He also confesses that in his prior book, which maybe some of you read, The Road to Character, that it was too individualistic. If you did read it, you would maybe perhaps remember that he makes a contrast between the kind of virtue that's driven by resume versus a virtue that's driven by kind of eulogy. So the resume, of course, is about building, climbing. You could see that. The eulogy is, how do you want to be remembered? But this is what happened. In this book, The Second Mountain, he realized even that, although it was a helpful distinction, it was still about improving oneself. And he thought there should be a more corporate or communal emphasis. And that's what he's trying to do in the second mountain. And so rather than focus on self-improvement, he highlights giving oneself away. So what do you think of distinguishing between the individual and society? And what image comes to mind when you think about giving yourself away? Does that seem like a positive? Does that seem scary? How does that feel? These are good questions for the group. He also labels 6 types of joy, which I thought was a pretty bold thing to do, because he's really doing some kind of fine distinguishing work there. You know, he's kind of parsing it out, and he's got them as levels, from the physical of experiencing flow alone or in a group, or to the celebratory, where this kind of collective effervescence. He even talks about dance, to emotional, where you maybe have this unexplainable epiphany or revelation, the spiritual, mystical attunement, the transcendent, feeling at one with nature. And some of you may, looking at those first 5, say, well, I don't know how you decide that one's above the other. But for him, the moral is the highest, a kind of self-forgetfulness. So what do you make of these various layers or levels of joy? And do you think of the latter one as the highest? And if so, what exactly does it mean? Something you didn't read, and I'll introduce some stuff every week that you haven't heard, but it'll be on the handout, and that'll help you and the discussion leaders with the kind of keep you on track. The German sociologist Gerd Gunther Voss names 3 forms of what he calls the conduct of life. So he has this example, a vocation, for instance. Maybe you became a travel agent. So the 3 ways that this would happen, he says, first would be traditional. So let's say your parents were travel agents, and on weekends and summers, you were hanging out, you're a little kid, you're just playing on the Etch-a-Sketch or whatever. But slowly but surely, you found yourself kind of working there. And now 20 years later, you took on the family business. Or the situational, let's say you went to a travel agent to book a flight. You wanted to get out of this crazy weather and go somewhere warm, like Aruba or something. And the person said, I know this is weird, but you wouldn't happen to be looking for a job, would you? And the next thing you know, years go by and you're a travel agent. It just happened by a situation. But then the third type is strategic. You're in high school, you're in college, and you say, you know, here's the thing. I know I got to make a living and I love to travel. I think I'll be a travel agent. It makes sense. It would be a strategic approach. Well, he takes this and he says, well, what if this was not about vocation, but deciding what our lives would be like? So traditionally, a lot of us inherit a pattern of what the good life looks like from our culture and our family. That, by the way, is the whole idea behind that personal inventory that I hope you worked on in preparation for tonight. If you didn't, it's okay, because they can ask you questions in the group and you can just do it off the top of your head. But so many of us get messages from the culture and our family about what a life is supposed to look like, and that would be tradition. Situational would be more like, I don't know how it is that I came to see the world this way. I don't know how this came to be my worldview. I just sort of stumbled onto it. I read something, somebody said something, I went to a workshop, a seminar. But strategic, of course, would be where he puts his emphasis, and that is, in essence, to do what we're doing for 5 weeks. And that is to actually pause and to look at the life that we're living. One image that I'm kind of fond of is, you know, those gerbils that get in the wheel and they just run and run and run, and they go through these little tunnels. Well, what would it mean to get out of that for a moment and to kind of look at it and say, so that's my life. What is that the way I want my life to be? And so that's that kind of strategic reflection. There's also a fascinating study, and you can just Google this and read the whole thing. I'm not going to go into great detail, but Pew did a 2017 study with both open-ended and closed-ended questions around this one idea. What makes life meaningful? Americans overwhelmingly, 70%, family. But after that, they said things like career, money, faith, friendships, hobbies. And of course, everybody had different ways of rating these things. And it's really interesting to look at how race and religion were important factors in the breakdowns. But it raises questions. One in particular that I'm thinking about. Let's assume that family is meaningful for you. What besides family, though, makes life meaningful for you? Of those five things, or maybe another one after those, what, what makes life meaningful for you? So as we get ready to move into small group discussions, just a couple of little reminders. Each group is going to have a designated group leader to help facilitate discussion, and they know you're coming. They'll introduce themselves, and these groups they're relatively small. The idea, of course, is so that we can actually be involved. We can't do that with 200 people. And again, all perspectives are welcomed. I just can't stress that enough. The group time will begin every week with you introducing yourself again. It's the same group for the 5 weeks, but you'll tell people your name. And each week there'll be 3 this or that questions. Now this tells you everything they know about a person right here. Are you a cat or dog person? Chocolate or vanilla, beach or mountains? Well, every week there'll be a different set, and the group leader has them, and so they can remind you if you forget. But that's how we'll get started. We'll also do the personal inventory tonight. A couple of things I want to say about that. The poet Barbara Hardy, I love this quote. She says, "We dream a narrative, daydream a narrative, remember, anticipate, hope, despair, believe, doubt, plan, revise, criticize, construct, gossip, learn, hate, and love by narrative." We live in that book on the screen. We live in a story. So what is your story? How has the good life been defined throughout your life? When you're a kid, in the commercials you see now, at your work, whatever it is. And I do think that, by the way, this could be a form of journaling that you continue throughout the course and beyond. You might even want to come back to it in week 5 or just jot ideas down. There'll also be about 25 quotes every week. They're in the materials that you got. Hopefully you looked at those. And it's just a really great opportunity to read through those and see. My hunch is there'll be some that make you frown, there'll be some that make you laugh, and there'll be some that really catch you. And these are just great conversation starters. So group leaders will pretty regularly say, well, what about the quotes? What was, like your favorite, or which one really tripped you up, or that kind of thing. And it can get a lot of good discussion going. And then, of course, there'll be questions from the readings. The group leaders will have those. You have them. They're in the sheet there. And of course, just a reminder of kind of the big questions we're wrestling with, at least tonight. Is a life worth living the same for everyone? How might a person's social location impact the definition of the good life? Can the definition change over time? And interesting one, how has the pandemic affected your thinking on these things? A couple of last things. I do consider getting out of that hamster wheel, or whatever you want to call it, a privilege. For us to do something like this for 5 weeks together, to read and reflect, is a great gift. It's a privilege. So one image that I like comes from George Lakoff's book, The Political Mind. We're not going to go into bipartisan or partisan politics, but let me just show you what he gets at. He describes 2 kinds of thinking, and in some ways they correspond to left brain and right brain kind of stuff. The reflexive, which is your impressions and feelings about things, and the reflective, which is really driven by careful, rational thought. So for instance, he says, and you have to use your imagination because this has you at a mall. I don't know if you remember what a mall is, but let's say you're at a mall and we see you there, we're friends, and you're looking at sweaters. and it's a big stack of blue sweaters. And so, we say, oh, why are you looking at blue sweaters? I, I don't know. I, I have no idea why I'm looking at blue ones. Um, it's reflexive. You can't explain it. Now, if you say on the other hand, the family, grandkids, everybody, we're doing a big photo. Everybody's got to wear blue or tan or whatever it is. I got to get a blue sweater. That would be reflective. Well, Lakoff says that people go into the voting booth and sometimes could not articulate why they are voting the way they are. And of course, as writing about politics, he wants people to use reflective thinking. Well, if you apply it to what we're talking about, what does a life worth living look like? A lot of people would just sort of have impressions and feelings. Not that those aren't important, but what we're trying to do is move those into our conscious mind and to ask questions like, what does a life worth living look like? How would I define it? And you may recognize this notion. Here's a quote from Rumi. Maybe you are searching in the branches for what only exists in the roots. Maybe you are searching in the branches for what only exists in the roots. And as we would say in the Socrates Cafe, it's something to think about. Well, our tech person is going to put us into groups. You may have to click on a little agree button there or something when it pops up, but hopefully you'll be in a group here in a moment. And I hope it's a really great discussion.